Today is June 2nd, 2018, and we are in the Feast of Unleavened Bread of the second month, and we have been studying the historicity of the Exodus with the thought in mind of seeing how an understanding of this subject impacts how one might view the character of our Heavenly Family. So let us start with asking our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, once again, we thank you for guiding us to be in a mental place where we can ask some of the questions that we are currently asking and conduct the investigations that we are conducting at this time. Please help us to be rid of our preconceived ideas and biases. Help us to clearly think regarding these issues and to only love the truth rather than having preferences. Please help us to see who you are through all this and to come to the end of this meeting having learned something. Thank you so much. We ask this b'shem Tanach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
So I recommend, first of all, for anyone listening to this later, to go back to our previous meetings to get a broader explanation of the background of how we came to this current place. For the sake of this meeting, I'm going to fast track our recap or explanation as to why we're studying what we're studying and what it means so that we can get into the content more quickly. So basically, the most essential things for all of us to keep in mind as we enter into this is that we've learned the importance of dealing with reality on its own merits and not making claims and believing positions which are unsubstantiated. And within this broad principle, we have had several realizations. One of those realizations is that a very common claim regarding a certain section of the Bible is, in fact, a not true claim. And before I even mention exactly what that claim is, I'll mention that it's not a claim that the Bible makes, it's a claim that people make concerning a section of the Bible. And that section is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, otherwise known as the Torah or the Pentateuch or the 5 books of Moses. It is often claimed concerning those books that they were written by Moses. Again, those books do not make that claim. And in fact, those books give every indication that that claim is not true. The first 5 books of the Bible were not, in fact, written by Moses. And in fact, they were not written by any one individual. They were written by several different individuals at different times with different perspectives. And in seeking to deal with these writings upon their own merits, we have seen the need to discern their own claims as distinct from what others claim about them. So the various writings that make up the Pentateuch, so far as we know, were written by people who did not claim to be representatives of God or to write what they wrote under the special inspiration of the Holy Spirit or anything like that. Furthermore, they don't claim to be eyewitnesses of the events that they describe. They simply tell the story, and they tell their stories differently from each other. Now, when we're talking about these various authors, the way that we have been referring to them and viewing them thus far has been in harmony with how most modern biblical scholars understand the authors of the Pentateuch. That is through the lens of the documentary hypothesis, which states that there are 4 primary texts which were combined together to make the Torah as we have it, with the addition of several other fragments of texts that are outside of those four primary texts. Those four primary texts are referred to as J, E, P, and D, and I think everyone on the call at this moment already knows something about each one of those sources and kind of how we are approaching them. As it relates to the subject of the Exodus, as I've already mentioned, these sources give different pictures, and not only do they give different pictures of what happened, but they also give different pictures of the character of Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel. And in this investigation, we want to find out what these various texts claim about Yahweh, what these various texts have to tell us about what really happened in the Exodus. So we have to compare them critically. We have to study each one on its own right. Ultimately, though, it's not just a matter of understanding each text. It's understanding the actual facts of the history which they potentially present or potentially misrepresent. These are all things that we have to discover. And one of the things that's very relevant when it comes to the presentation of Yahweh is the presentation of Moses, since Moses is understood in all of these texts to be the vicegerent of Yahweh, the spokesperson of Yahweh to the people. And so whatever Moses' message actually was certainly matters in regard to this discussion. So with that said, we have focused specifically in these past couple meetings on looking at the texts in the Torah that reference Moses having written something and potentially even give the content of what he wrote. So to be a little bit more specific on this, while the Torah itself does not claim Moses as its author, and while the sources of the Torah, J, E, P, and D, do not claim Moses as their authors, some of these sources, and indeed in one instance, one of the editors, refers to Moses writing certain things. And sometimes it gives the content of that writing. There are 6 such instances like this in the Torah. 2 of them are in the E source. 1 is in the J source. 1 is in the redactor or the final editor. And 2 others are in the D source. More specifically, 1 is thought to be within the first edition of D, Deuteronomy, and the other is thought to be in the second edition of Deuteronomy. We have looked at the first one, and just as a reminder, this first reference to Moses writing a text is in Exodus 17, verse 14, which is part of the E narrative. And it refers to Moses writing something, though that something is debated as to what exactly it is. Some scholars think that that something is the story of the defeat of the Amalekites by Joshua, and Moses is thought to have written that, in which case the actual text that Moses wrote is now lost, not represented within the Torah or the E text, though potentially, since the E author knows about it and references it, it's at least possible that the E author was using it as a source for the story of the fight between Joshua and the Amalekites. again, that's one interpretation of what Moses wrote. Another interpretation of what Moses is claimed to have written in Exodus 17:14 is a declaration against the Amalekites, in which Yahweh says that he will blot out the memory of the Amalekites forever. Those are the two different interpretations. We discussed it briefly last night and did not come to conclusions, though we voiced a couple of reasons in favor and against both interpretations. What we are doing at the present time in these meetings is not to look at one of these instances of claimed Mosaic writings and focus on it until we come to conclusions and then move to the next. No, instead what we are doing is we are looking at one, getting at least a brief overview of the issues regarding it and the content of the text if applicable, and then we will move to the next one without necessarily having come to conclusions regarding whether Moses wrote it or whether it was historically accurate or inaccurate or to what degree and so on. Right now we're just getting an overview, and I think this is really a good way to do it when it comes to our meetings here, because we cannot cover everything in the meetings, and this will serve to get people in contact with the issues for their own personal study. So by going through this as we are, you will all be familiar with the basics regarding hopefully each of these 6 texts that Moses is claimed to have written by various sources within the Pentateuch. And when it comes to the principles of how to go about examining these texts and the claims of these Pentateuchal sources, I would like to remind you all again that it would be a good idea, if you're trying to understand the principles of how to go about doing this investigation, to consider past studies that we have had doing similar things. Most recently, we examined some of the historical questions regarding Jesus and his relationship to John the Baptist. That's one instance where you can get some of the principles involved in conducting such an investigation. And then going back further, we have investigating the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15. We did that during the Feast of Unleavened Bread of the first month. That has some of the principles. Going back yet further, we have conducted quite an in-depth historical investigation into whether Jesus' mother was actually a virgin at the time of his conception and or birth. So those studies, especially on the virgin birth, are available, and you can find them on YouTube, and they can be helpful for reminding yourself about the principles. But again, here we are really getting an overview of these various texts. At the end of last night's meeting, we looked at the second text, which has claimed Mosaic authorship within the Pentateuch, and the claim is made again within the E text. And what we found last night, we did not read the entirety of what we need to get a hold of this particular example of a claimed Mosaic document, which we'll do tonight. But we looked at basically the possible parameters of that text and what the e-source says about it. The context, again, and you can find this whole section from Exodus chapter 20 to Exodus 24. That's the broad section at which we are looking. In Exodus 20, we find a description of Moses having a conversation with Yahweh. It starts in verse 18, and we read it last night, so I won't read it again here. But it basically talks about Yahweh speaking to Moses. Well, Yahweh was initially intending to speak to all the people, but the people did not desire that. They would rather have Yahweh speak to Moses, and then Moses would speak to them, presumably because it was a scary experience. Yahweh speaking was accompanied by thunders and flashes and sound of a horn and a smoking mountain, and they were evidently afraid. And so they just told Moses to speak to Yahweh. So as the e-text presents it, that's what happens. And at the end of the things that Yahweh says to Moses, it says that Moses wrote all of Yahweh's words and that he built an altar and, offered offerings or certain others made offerings. And then Moses sprinkled the blood, and then he took the scroll and read it in the people's ears. And they said, we will do everything that Yahweh has spoken. And it's interesting, in Exodus 24, verse 7, when it talks about him taking the scroll and reading it to the people, it says he took the scroll of the covenant. The e-source does not contain the Ten Commandments. So it doesn't have the Ten Commandments as kind of like the covenant between God and his people or anything like that. It has this section, which is between the end of Exodus 20 and the beginning of Exodus 24. And this is the scroll of the covenant in the e-source. So not only does it claim Moses to have written down these words, but it claims that this is the covenant between Yahweh and the children of Israel. So this makes it, of course, quite significant. We read last night Exodus chapter 20, verses 18 to 26, and it discussed the possibility that what Moses is claimed to have written actually starts in verse 22, because it says, and Yahweh said to Moses, you shall say this to the children of Israel, etc., etc., etc. So that looks like, well, this is what Yahweh said to Moses. And since it says that Moses wrote down all the words of Yahweh, well then, it kind of leaves one with the impression that maybe he started writing the content of what Yahweh said from what we find in verse 22. However, in Exodus chapter 21, verse 1, it says, these are the judgments that you shall set before them. And then it gives a list of commands. And saying these are the judgments that you shall set before them, one might take that as like an introductory clause into a writing. And then from chapter 21, verse 2, down to chapter 23, verse 19, there's this list of commands. And it's just command after command. That might be taken as a separate document, in which case it would be a more limited section. In any case, it will be good for us to read this document to get what the e-source is claiming Moses to have written, and beyond that, then we can see how it relates to the historical investigation of the Exodus, how it relates to Moses' message, and to the character of Yahweh. So with that said, would anyone like to start reading from Exodus chapter 21, verse 1, going forward? Again, we want to read all of chapter 21, all of chapter 22, and all of chapter 23. So if someone wants to read the whole thing, you can do that. Or if you would like to read just a part, and then someone else can take over, that's okay too. But would someone like to volunteer to read at least the first section?
And these are the judgments that you shall set before them. When you will buy a Hebrew slave, he shall work 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out liberated for free. If he will come by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he is a woman's husband, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master will give him a wife, and she will give birth to sons or daughters for him, the wife and her children will be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. And if the slave will say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I won't go out liberated, then his master shall bring him over to God and bring him over to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. And if a man will sell his daughter as a maid, she shall not go out as the slaves go out. If she is bad in the eyes of her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall not dominate so as to sell her to a foreign people in his betrayal of her. And if he will designate her for his son, he shall treat her according to the manner of daughters. If he will take another for himself, he shall not subtract from her food, her apparel, and her hygiene. And if he will not do these three for her, then she shall go out free. There is no money. One who strikes a man and he dies, he shall be put to death. And one who did not scheme, but God conveyed it to his hand, I shall set a place for you, that he shall flee there. But if a man will plot against his neighbor to kill him with treachery, you shall take him from my altar to die. And one who strikes his father and his mother shall be put to death. And one who steals a man and has sold him, or he was found in his hand, will be put to death. And one who curses his father and his mother shall be put to death. And if people will quarrel, and a man strikes his neighbor with a stone or with a fist, and he does not die, and he falls to bed, if he will get up and walk himself outside on his staff, then the one who struck will be innocent. Only he shall compensate for his staying home, and shall have him healed. And if a man will strike his slave or his maid with a rod, and he dies by his hand, he shall be avenged. Just if he will stand for a day or 2 days, he shall not be avenged, because he is his money. And if people will fight, and they strike a pregnant woman, and her children go out, and there will not be an injury, he shall be penalized according to what the woman's husband will impose on him, and he will give it by the judges. And if there will be an injury, then you shall give a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a hurt for a hurt. And if a man will strike his slave's eye or his maid's eye and destroy it, he shall let him go, liberated, for his eye. And if he will knock out his slave's tooth or his maid's tooth, he shall let him go, liberated, for his tooth. And if an ox will gore a man or a woman and they die, the ox shall be stoned, and its meat shall not be eaten, and the ox's owner is innocent. And if it was a goring ox from the day before yesterday, and it had been so testified to its owner, and he did not watch it, and it killed a man or a woman, the ox will be stoned, and its owner will be put to death as well. If a ransom will be set on him, then he shall give everything that will be set on him for the redemption of his life. Whether it will gore a son or it will gore a daughter, according to this judgment shall be done to it. If the ox will gore a slave or a maid, he shall pay 30 silver shekels to his owner, and the ox shall be stoned. And if a man will open a pit, or if a man will dig a pit, and he will not cover it, and an ox or an ass will fall there, the owner of the pit shall pay. He shall pay back money to its owner, and the dead one will be his. And if a man's ox will strike his neighbor's ox, and it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and split the money for it, and they shall split the dead one as well. Or if it was known that it was a goring ox from the day before yesterday, and its owner did not watch it, he shall pay an ox for the ox, and the dead one shall be his. If a man will steal an ox or a sheep and slaughter it or sell it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So I'm just happy to keep reading if that's fine with everyone. Or unless someone else wants to read, I'm fine with that too.
Anyone have a comment on that?
We're okay either way also, so if you want to keep on, that's fine.
Yeah, okay, we're good. I'll just keep reading. I'm benefiting from doing the reading, actually, so as long as I'm not hindering someone else from benefiting, I'll just keep going. Chapter 22. If the thief will be found while breaking in and will be struck and he dies, there is no blood for him. If the sun has risen on him, there is blood for him. He shall pay. If he does not have it, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the theft will be found in his hand, from ox to ass to sheep, alive, he shall pay 2. If a man will have a field or a vineyard grazed, and he will let his beast go and graze in another person's field, he shall pay the best of his field and the best of his vineyard. If fire will break out and find thorns and stacked grain or standing grain, or a field is consumed, the one who set the blaze shall pay. If a man will give his neighbor money or items to watch, and it will be stolen from the man's house, if the thief will be found, he shall pay 2. If the thief will not be found, then the owner of the house shall be brought near to God, that he has not put out his hand into his neighbor's property. Over every case of an offense, over an ox, over an ass, over a sheep, over clothing, over every loss about which one will say that this is it, the word of the 2 of them shall come to God. The one whom God will implicate shall pay 2 to his neighbor. If a man will give an ass or an ox or a sheep or any animal to his neighbor to watch, and it dies or is injured or is seized, no one seeing, an oath of Yahweh shall be between the 2 of them, that he has not put out his hand into his neighbor's property, and its owner shall take it, and he shall not pay. And if it will be stolen from him, he shall pay its owner. If it will be torn, he shall bring it in witness. He shall not pay for the torn one. And if a man will ask it of his neighbor, and it is injured or dies, its owner not being with it, he shall pay. If its owner is with it, he shall not pay. If it was hired, he has its hire coming to him. And if a man will deceive a virgin who is not betrothed, and he lies with her, he shall espouse her by a bride price to him as a wife. If her father will refuse to give her to him, he shall weigh out money corresponding to the bride price of virgins. You shall not let a witch live. Anyone who lies with an animal shall be put to death. One who sacrifices to gods shall be completely destroyed, except to Yahweh alone. And you shall not persecute an alien, and you shall not oppress him, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not degrade any widow or orphan. If you will degrade them, when they will cry out to me, I'll hear their cry, and my anger will flare, and I'll kill you with a sword, and your wives will be widows, and your children orphans. If you will lend money to my people, to the poor who is with you, you shall not be like a creditor to him. You shall not impose interest on him. If you take your neighbor's clothing as security, you shall give it back to him by the sunset, because it is his only apparel. It is his clothing for his skin. In what will he sleep? And it will be when he will cry out to me that I shall listen, because I am gracious. Do not curse a chieftain among your people. You shall not delay your fulfillment and your flowing. You shall give me the firstborn of your sons. You shall do this to your ox and to your sheep. 7 days it will be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. And you shall be holy people to me. And you shall not eat meat in the field that is torn. You shall throw it to the dog. Chapter 23. You shall not bring up a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked person to be a malevolent witness. You shall not be following many to do bad, and you shall not testify about a dispute to bend following many to bend it. And you shall not favor a weak person in his dispute. If you will happen upon your enemy's ox or his ass straying, you shall bring it back to him. If you will see the ass of someone who hates you sagging under its burden, and you would hold back from helping him, you shall help with him. You shall not bend the judgment of your poor in his dispute. You shall keep far from a word of a lie, and do not kill an innocent and a virtuous person, because I shall not vindicate a wicked person. And you shall not take a bribe, because bribery will blind those who can see and will undermine the words of the virtuous. And you shall not oppress an alien, since you know the alien's soul, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. And 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its produce. And the 7th you shall let it lie fallow and leave it. And your people's indigent will eat, and what they leave the animal of the field will eat. You shall do this to your vineyard, to your olive. 6 days you shall do the things you do, and on the 7th day you shall cease, so that your ox and your ass will rest, and your maid son and the alien will be refreshed. And you shall be watchful in everything that I have said to you, and you shall not commemorate the name of other gods. Let it not be heard on your mouth. You shall celebrate 3 pilgrimages for me in the year. You shall observe the festival of unleavened bread. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you, at the appointed time of the month of Abib, because you went out of Egypt in it. And none shall appear before me empty. And the festival of harvest, the first fruits of what you do, of what you will sow in the field. And the festival of gathering, at the end of the year, when you gather what you have done from the field. 3 times in the year, every male of yours shall appear in front of the Lord Yahweh. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice on leavened bread, and the fat of my festival shall not remain until morning. You shall bring the first of the first fruits of your land to the house of Yahweh, your God. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk.
So just to pause right here, this is one possible ending of the text that the e-source is claiming Moses to have written, since this is kind of the end of these direct commands. But it is also possible that the e-source is claiming that Moses wrote the rest of what Yahweh is supposed to have said to him, which includes the rest of the content of the chapter. So I just wanted to interrupt the reading to make that brief comment.
Okay. Here, I'm sending an angel ahead of you to watch over you on the way and to bring you to the place that I've prepared. Be watchful in front of him and listen to his voice. Don't rebel against him, because he will not bear your offense, because my name is within him. But if you will listen to his voice and do everything that I speak, then I'll be an enemy to your enemies and an opponent to your opponents. When my angel will go ahead of you and will bring you to the Amorite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Canaanite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, and I obliterate them, you shall not bow to their gods. You shall not serve them, and you shall not do like the things they do, but you shall tear them down and shatter their pillars. And you will serve Yahweh, your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I shall turn sickness away from within you. There won't be a bereaved woman and an infertile woman in your land. I shall fulfill the number of your days. I shall have my terror go ahead of you, and I shall throw all the people against whom you come into tumult, and I shall give all your enemies to you by the back. And I shall send the hornet ahead of you, and it will drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from in front of you. I won't drive them out from in front of you in 1 year, or else the land will be a devastation, and the animal of the field will be many at you. Little by little I shall drive them out from in front of you, until you will be fruitful, and you will have a legacy of the land. Strange, weren't they millions according to, sorry, that just struck me. So, until you will be fruitful, and you will have a legacy of the land. And I shall set your borders from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the river, because I shall put the residents of the land in your hand, and you'll drive them out from in front of you. You shall not make a covenant with them and with their gods. They shall not live in your land, in case they will make you sin against me when you'll serve their gods, because it will be a trap for you.
Okay, excellent. So that is the end of what Yahweh is said here to have said to Moses, at least uninterrupted. In the beginning of Exodus 24, it says, "And he said to Moses, come up to Yahweh, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and bow from a distance." So, it does have a little bit more, which it is, actually, I'm going to just keep reading a little bit here just to get the rest of the context until verse 4.
Where are you?
In Exodus 24, I've already read verse 1, and I'll read verse 2 and 3 and 4. "And Moses will come over alone to Yahweh, and they shall not come over, and the people shall not come up with him. And Moses came and told the people all of Yahweh's words and all the judgments. And all the people answered one voice, and they said, we'll do the things that Yahweh has spoken. And Moses wrote all of Yahweh's words, and he got up early in the morning and built an altar below the mountain and 12 pillars for 12 tribes of Israel," etc., etc. So that gives a little bit more of the context where the e-source is claiming that after all of these words that Yahweh said to Moses, that Moses went and spoke these words to the people, they agreed to do it, and then he wrote all those words down, and then ended up taking that writing, reading it to the people. They agreed again, and they basically instituted the covenant with agreement and sacrifice and blood ritual. So, with all that said and all that read, does anyone have any comments or questions?
Okay, is this the are these the laws, codes, the same as the code of Hammurabi? Is that what Teresa was saying last night?
I didn't say that all of them were from the law code of Hammurabi, but I did say that some of them are, and in fact, very many of them are. If you just Google law code of Hammurabi or code of Hammurabi or law of Hammurabi, there's many different places where you can read them in greater or lesser degree, and you will find very many parallel, if not almost word for word, descriptions conveyed in this passage that I just read with that law code. And that code of Hammurabi, it's a Babylonian law code. I forget how far it predates Moses. Do you know, honey?
I don't remember.
A few hundred years at least, I think.
Yeah, and plus it's hard to say if we haven't dated the Exodus.
Oh, I think it was around 1700 BC. But, honestly, they aren't 100% fixed on the date for the law code of Hammurabi or the reign of Hammurabi. I remember looking at this a bit in my presentation on the whole question of divorce and remarriage and all that. And it's pretty well agreed upon a span of date. And I think it was around 1700 BC, something like that. But there's at least one proposed date that's quite a bit different. But anyway, the main consensus is that it's 1700 BC, around there, which would be a few hundred years prior to the time of Moses, as the general consensus among scholars, as I...
Right, it would be like 500 years prior to the general consensus. But again, it's debated. But either way, it's prior to most dates that have been put forward for the time of the Exodus and the time of Moses. Yeah, most dates are definitely after 1700 BC. So most would definitely view the Hammurabi Code as influencing this rather than vice versa, especially since there wasn't a people proclaiming themselves as followers of Moses or as being Israelites or something like that until like 1200, well, just before 1200 BC. And so that's long after. So in other words, even if Moses existed and wrote this prior to 1700 BC, which again is a way earlier date than most scholars would say, it's very unlikely that something that Moses wrote would influence Hammurabi. The other direction is a far more likely path of influence. Any other comments or questions or observations?
I have a question. So, Exodus 21 and 22 doesn't sound like God character, but they are in the Jewish law. Is that right? Do you know if any Hebrew Bible people or Jews they are practicing this now?
Okay, so Exodus 21 and 22 seem to be out of harmony with God's character, but it seems to be part of the Jewish law. And so you're asking if anyone's practicing this now. I don't know of anyone who's practicing this as a whole right now. There are elements of this that people practice, like, so far as I know, Jews still do not boil kids in their mother's milk, and
baby goats,
and
baby sheep.
Yeah, and furthermore, the Sabbath commandment is in here. There are other commandments that people do observe, But there's a whole lot that people don't. Like there's laws about slavery and that sort of thing. I don't know anyone who's observing these laws today. What we can say is that it is at least a section of ancient Israelite law, which some people in the northern kingdom of Israel, which is the place to which the e-text belongs, or the place from which it originated, at least some people in the northern kingdom considered it a law that was supposed to be kept. Whether anyone actually kept it or not is another question, but it seems to be that in order for it to be included here, and in order for it to be written at all, at least someone believed that this should have been kept. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I have a few things that I'd like to say. Again, this whole investigation of the historicity of the Exodus being done with the intention of trying to learn whatever we can about the character of the Father, because of the importance of knowing the true character of our heavenly family, because it will help us gain victory over sin and that sort of thing. And since our heavenly family has shown us that morality is not based upon their declaration as an arbitrary choice, rather their declaration is a description of what just is already the right thing to do and the right way to live. The basis for morality is materialism. There's a whole lot wrong with this section, or at least large portions of the section, in my observation. The whole idea of owning another human being is immoral. The whole idea of selling your daughter, definitely immoral. And of course, if you were to sell your son, same deal. The whole idea of it being okay to kill your slave so long as he or she didn't die for a couple of days because they're your money. No, that's not right. I'm so grateful for knowing about the documentary hypothesis, because the fact that these sorts of things are in the Bible, it's no wonder people who think that you have to accept everything in the Bible wholesale or reject everything wholesale, if they're true to moral thinking at all, yeah, they're going to reject the Bible. But when you realize that these are just a whole lot of different books written by a whole lot of different people, and they have to be tested individually, and then when you realize that the Pentateuch could not have been written by Moses himself, but it's a compilation and a stitching together of several different writers who don't even claim to be inspired, well, that's a relief.
It certainly separates it from other writings that are also contained in this library that we call, quote unquote, the Bible. And it really shows how they definitely ought to be judged independently from each other.
Yeah. So in this, okay, so this doesn't have a whole lot of comment in regard to the Exodus. It does mention that, hey, you're not supposed to oppress, a foreigner because you know what it's like to be a foreigner, Well, that's nice. I mean, that's a good way to be, for sure. But just because, you shouldn't oppress anybody no matter what. But definitely don't use the excuse that they're a foreigner because you should know better. You're a foreigner. Well, that seems to indicate some sort of exodus, whether it was a huge number or not. But the thing that I stopped about and said, oh, well, that's interesting. in this passage, it seems like the writer of this source, like, did they really think there were millions of people in the Exodus? Because he's talking about how God says he's going to send the hornets ahead of them to drive out these various peoples little by little, because you can't drive them out all at once, or else there's going to be all these wild animals take over because your numbers are small. And, until you reproduce and be able to fill up the land and subdue the wild animals, it's better to leave these other peoples there so that at least you're not being devoured by a whole bunch of beasts, So what is this, chapter 23, verse 28 and on, little by little shall I drive them out from in front of you until you will be fruitful and you will have a legacy of the land. So that doesn't seem to me to indicate that this writer was picturing millions of people. They could easily have just filled the land. So
Right. Yeah, it seems like it's definitely picturing it as a smaller number of people than could just go and immediately fill all the land. And furthermore, it does definitely have an idea of a conquest of Canaan, but it certainly doesn't have an idea of a very quick conquest, because it has to be slow enough to have the reproduction of enough people to fill the land from whatever size it implies. One thing I want to mention, though, earlier when you pointed out an Exodus and you said that it indicates an Exodus, it at least indicates a belief in the Exodus,
right?
But it doesn't necessarily indicate that an actual Exodus happened.
Well, sure, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, okay, how about this? I want to ask a couple questions about this. Some of the main questions. Well, actually, first, before I even ask questions, I'll just ask one question. When we read a text, what are some of the first questions that we need to be asking?
Who wrote the text? If there's a claim, we need to make sure that the claim is accurate. We need to know who the audience of the text was intended, and we need to know of any biases that the author might have had, and ultimately what the goal of the text is, what he's trying to accomplish, he or she is trying to accomplish.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree with all of that for sure. And the only other main thing that I would add is the date of the text, which could be included. Like, if we can determine authorship and we know when the author lived, well, that kind of answers the dating part too. But if we can't determine who wrote it, we might still be able to determine when it was written. So that's why sometimes it's important to consider that as a separate item. But, we are a little bit over an hour now into this meeting, so we won't linger long on this. But I just briefly want to ask, and it shouldn't take too long for people to mention some answers. Does this text claim to be written by Moses?
In my opinion, no, it does not. It even says, and Moses wrote all of Yahweh's words. So a third party is making a claim that Moses wrote all the words, not Moses himself claiming.
I agree.
Yeah, I would agree with that aspect too. However, I will say that that's getting to chapter 24. So, like, the idea here is that the e-text in chapter 24 is saying Moses wrote all of these words, or all the words that Yahweh had spoken to him, and those are the words that are just quoted as Yahweh having spoken to Moses. So the idea is that he is claiming that Moses wrote a whole bunch of words that he just included in his own text. So it's like citing it as a source. So the e-source isn't claiming that Moses wrote anything that we find in chapter 24, but the e-source does seem to be claiming that Moses wrote what we find in chapter 21, 22, and 23, possibly going back as far as Exodus chapter 20, verse 22b, and possibly like the two possible ending places are chapter 23, verse 19, or chapter 23, verse 33. So it seems like the E source is claiming that Moses wrote those words. Again, those two possible ranges, but basically from chapter 21 to 23, the E source is claiming that Moses wrote those words. So the real question is, when we read those words as we just did, let's say that represents a document that preceded E. Looking at those words, do they claim to have been written by Moses?
I don't think so.
Yeah, we don't see that. No.
Go ahead.
Just saying, we say no also.
And I was just going to add that the e-source is claiming that Moses wrote a lot of words that from our other investigations and getting to know God as we think he really is, he wouldn't have given Moses those words to write anyway. But the e-source doesn't really prove that Moses wrote it. He just said he did. So anyway, that's the other thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, I would say that these things in Exodus directly ascribe authorship to Moses, right? When he's told to record on a scroll the episode of Israel's victory over Amalek, and then he was instructed to write down the 10 Commandments, and he was told to write down everything the Lord said in Exodus 24. So it's basically ascribing authorship to Moses is what I'd like to say.
Right, yeah. The e-text for this, and in the instance in Exodus 17, it's saying that Moses wrote something for sure. So, yeah, the question is, do those texts actually claim Mosaic authorship?
I haven't seen any claim in those texts. So the question is, in chapters 21, 22, and 23, what is claimed by the e-text that Moses actually wrote, do those chapters in themselves have any claim by Moses that he wrote them? And no, in fact, leading up to it, you can even go back and say, oh, well, what about leading up to it? In the last of chapter 20, you still have it third person. So chapter 20, verse 20, and Moses said to the people. So it's not, and I, Moses, said to the people. It's someone else writing, so the writer of the e-source. And Moses said to the people, don't be afraid because God is coming for the purpose of testing you, et cetera, et cetera. So then the people stood at a distance. Moses went over to the nimbus where God was, and Yahweh said to Moses, you shall say this to the children of Israel. And then it goes on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Verse 26, and you shall not go up by stairs on my altar so that your nudity will not be exposed over it. And these are the judgments that you shall set before them. So this is still Yahweh speaking to Moses about what he's wanting Moses to do according to the author of the e-source. But nowhere here do you see Moses, first person, stepping in his writing, if he did indeed write this, and saying, and so I wrote down these words. It could say, and Moses was told to write down these words, and I wrote down these words. No, there's nothing like that.
So I will say, in regard to the stuff preceding verse 22, and specifically verse 22b, anything before that, it's again only telling us whether or not the e-source is claiming to have been written by Moses itself. And so in order to analyze whether this document being quoted by the e-source claims Mosaic authorship, we're looking only at verse 22b onward to the end of chapter 23, if we're taking it in its broadest possible sense, or if we narrow it down and view the document being quoted as a shorter text, we're just looking at chapter 21, verse 1 or 2, to chapter 23, verse 19. And so, really, anything outside of that range is just letting us know whether the e-source is claiming to have been written by Moses. Within this range, though, it doesn't seem to mention Moses at all, either in first person or in third person. And so with that, again, it doesn't actually seem to make any claim that Moses wrote it. Of course, someone could write a text anonymously, and that includes Moses. He could write a text without identifying himself. But if there's no claim to begin with from within the writing, we'd have to have something to go by in order to justify the attribution, or to even say, like, oh, this is definitely something, like, it's not even a claim which the text itself makes. So it's kind of like you have to take extra steps to even justify that as a possibility. So that's just the first thing to keep in mind, that it doesn't actually claim to have been written by Moses. The e-source does claim that this text that we find in chapters 21 to 23, speaking generally, was written by Moses. That's the e-text's claim. That isn't this document's claim, so far as we can tell. So that's the first thing to just keep in mind. I suppose we could go further to talk about the nature of the document and also its possible date and that sort of thing. But we're going to have to save further discussion on it for tomorrow night, since we've already been on for an hour and 15 minutes. So I look forward to doing that. There's definitely more to discuss regarding this. And of course, there's always the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group in which we can discuss it further. But for now, we should bring an end to the meeting. So would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family, and we'll close off?
I will. So, Heavenly Family, we just thank you for this time together, and we just pray that we learn the principles and set them in our minds and live these principles in our lives. And just thank you for guiding us into all new truth, and that you continue to guide us into these truths. And we thank you for all this in the name of the Branch He and She. Amen.
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 All right. Love you all lots. Have a good night. Shalom.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.